Chapter 7 is about cognitive change. So again, we're talking about cognition, the way that people think and understand and reason and perceive, but it's a very different approach than the developmental approach that was taken by Piaget and Vygotsky. Instead, this is an information processing approach. So we'll be talking about things like memory and attention and processing of information. So I want you to think about this analogy of how your brain is kind of like a computer. So with a computer, right, you turn on your computer, you can open up a program like Excel and you input data. So you put in, now here you can see on the bottom right-hand side, you've got a list of names and dates and the amount, and then you can have it make calculations by adding up totals or averages. You can have it create charts in order to visually show this. And then you press save and you save that file for later. And it goes away from your desktop. It's stored on your hard drive. And then later on, you can open that file again, continuing to edit it and work on that information. Then again, you save it and put it away. It's a really good analogy for what's going on with your brain because we have a lot of information, but we're not working on all of the information all at once. The information that you learn can be stored away for later use, and then you bring back up that information and work on it while you're processing that information. So kind of think about studying for a class. You open up your textbook and you read through, right? We just learned about Piaget, and you read through the 4 stages of cognitive development of Piaget. So you read through that, you're thinking about it, you're evaluating it, you're trying to process that information to remember what each of the qualities of the stages are, and then you close your book. And you don't think about it for some time. You might not immediately be tested on it. And you go about your life and you, cook dinner for your family or do some grocery shopping or whatever it may be. And then later on, you want to bring that information back again and add back into your file, into your spreadsheet, process through that information a little bit more. And then eventually you get to the point where you want that file to be so well known that you're able to recall that information from the file without having the book in front of you. But each time you're pulling up that file, you're working on it. And that's how we get the name working memory. So just a little bit more about this analogy, right? So with computers, you get input and then it's processed with the software and stored on the hard drive on the hardware, and then you get an output after these operations like an Excel formula has been calculated. And with a human, kind of the same thing, but the way that information gets into our brain is with our sensory and perceptual systems. Think our vision and our hearing, that provides input, just like entering data into an Excel spreadsheet. And as input comes into your mind, mental processes, also called operations, act on it, just like the Excel sheet modifies and manipulates numbers. And then this transformed input is stored in memory for later use, just like how an Excel sheet can be retrieved and then displayed or printed later on. So in order to effectively process this information, we need to pay attention to different aspects of your cognition. How you pay attention to information, how you remember information, and also how you process or work with the information. So you have 3 major mental stores of memory: sensory, working, and long-term memory. Sensory memory holds information from your sensory systems in its original form. It's the first step into getting into your mind, but this only lasts for a very, very short time. Information fades very quickly from your sensory memory if it's not processed. So for example, you could hear someone laughing, and then for just a split second, maybe 1 or 2 seconds, you could almost reproduce the memory of them laughing in your mind, and then it fades away. Same thing, if you open up a door to a messy bedroom, for just a split second, you can hold the image in your mind of everything that was in that messy bedroom, but then it very, very quickly fades away if you don't process the information and actively try to remember it. So you can think of it like a flash. Now, In order for something to get into your sensory memory, you have to pay attention to it, and then to move it on into working memory, you continue to process and pay attention to it and begin working with it. So working memory involves holding and processing information that's currently being worked on. So you're manipulating it, you're attempting to remember it or encode it, or you're trying to retrieve it. So for example, if someone were to give you their phone number and you didn't have a pen or a piece of paper, if they just told you the number, it would be there for a split second and then go away. So what do you do to try to hold on to it? You repeat it, right? So you repeat the phone number, 8675309, 8675309, 8675309. So because you're currently working on it, you're able to hold it in your memory. So when you're working on it, it means that you're manipulating it, so you're considering it, you're comprehending it, you're thinking about it, you're encoding it, transforming it into a memory, or you just recalled the memory, you retrieved it from long-term memory and brought it into your conscious memory, kind of like opening the file on your desktop. All thoughts, your conscious mental activity, occur in working memory. So it's what you're currently aware of, what you're currently thinking and processing is what's involved in your working memory. So for example, if I asked you to recall what you had for dinner last night, that could probably come to memory fairly easily. It wasn't too long ago. And now you're thinking about it and you're like, oh gosh, that pasta was really good. Now, you weren't thinking about that pasta until I actually said so. So this means that I directed you to pull a memory from long term and then bring it into working memory. And now you're thinking about the taste of the pasta, the aroma, the texture of the pasta. So you're currently working on that information. Working memory has a limited capacity. And I talked about phone numbers, 8675309. Our phone numbers are only 7 digits for a reason, and that's because that's pretty much our limit for how many bits of information we can hold. We can't hold on to an unlimited amount. With sensory information, we can hold on to a lot. There's a lot in that messy bedroom, but that flash of that image disappears very quickly. So your working memory has what's called a central executive. Part of your working memory, this is a control processor, and it directs the flow of information and also regulates activities. It regulates your attention, what you look at, what you are attending to, your action that you take with this information and then carry out with the outside world, and also problem solving. Now, you may also hear the term executive function. This is collectively the phrase that we use to describe our cognitive activities that help us understand and work with information. Making decisions, solving problems, remembering, and coming up with an action plan. All has to do with executive functions. And then long-term memory, I've already hinted at. This is generally an unlimited store of information that holds onto that information roughly indefinitely. I mean, for your long-term memory, you will, have memory for things like information and things like what happened to you in your life, and I'll get to that in more elaboration in a moment. And generally, you can hold on to a lot of information. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that once you learn something, you will know it forever. We all know that it's very easy to forget something that you previously had known if you don't every once in a while think about it and process it again. So long-term memory, generally unlimited. It's not like once you learn psychology, you have to kick out all of the anthropology information, right? That's not how it works, but it's still not a perfect memory storage. Now let's talk about how attention and memory and processing changes with age. So infants are able to pay attention and to direct their awareness to a particular object or a person. And you can see this to a certain extent when they're newborns. They are generally able to kind of lock onto a picture or an object or a face as long as it's kind of close by. Remember how fuzzy their vision is, so it has to be close. and they can't track it all that well. So they can pay attention and direct their eyes towards certain things, but still they don't have great skills. Now, studies using preferential looking procedures, so they measure and compare the lengths of time that infants look at two separate stimuli, and also habituation procedures, they measure the length of time it takes infants to habituate or to show reduction in looking time to something that isn't changing, gives us an idea of what infants are paying attention to, and also it helps us with learning about what they remember. So infants show gain in attention by 10 weeks, and this increases over time. And they also show more attentiveness to a dynamic stimulus, a stimulus that changes over time, rather than static, unchanging stimuli, which just aren't nearly as interesting. So they'll show a lot more attention to a mobile that moves and has different features to it, as opposed to a picture that's hanging on their wall. Now, memory, newborns can recall visual and auditory stimuli. They can show memory for pictures as well as previous voices, even voices that they heard when they were inside the womb. They'll show a preference for their mother's language that she spoke, and also for nursery rhymes that mother sang while she was pregnant. They'll show recognition for that. Infants can also remember particular motor activities, and there's this really fascinating study that was done by Norco College, and this is what's depicted on the slide. This baby in a crib, and you'll notice that the baby has a blue ribbon tied around his ankle, and the ribbon goes up to the mobile. And essentially, the baby is learning that there's a connection here, that when I kick, I cause the toys to move, the mobile to move. And that's just naturally reinforcing. They get excited by that because it's dynamic and changing and interesting. So with this, it's essentially operant conditioning. They're rewarding the behavior of kicking. They're teaching the infant to kick to move the mobile. Then they test, they bring the baby back in and then hook them up to the mobile and see if there's, that light bulb that turns on. Oh, I remember this, I kick. And this makes it move. Now, if they show memory for it, then they'll jump right in it and start to kick and move the mobile and have fun with it. But if they don't remember, then they'll have to relearn this association all over again, and it will take them longer to make the mobile move. Now, we see that 2-month-olds are able to hold on to this memory for a few days, and then it kind of fades. 3-month-olds are able to hold on to the memory for up to 1 week, but the memories are very context dependent. So if more than one item is substituted in the 5 items on the mobile, then the memory retrieval is disrupted. So they're not just remembering the mobile, but they're remembering exactly what it looks like. And when it looks slightly different, it doesn't trigger the memory that this is the mobile that I can kick and make move. Similar, if the background color changes, they don't remember the image. They don't remember the context. Now, at 6 to 7 months old, they can hold on to this memory for up to 6 weeks. And now they're starting to show some memory across different conditions. So now we can start to change the mobile a little bit, and they'll have an easier time with remembering that particular context. Now, emotional engagement enhances infants' memory. So they're more likely to associate or to remember events associated with emotions. There's something called a still face paradigm, where they will show a video of a person speaking and smiling and being engaging, and then all of a sudden the person will just show flat affect, meaning they won't show any expression and they'll become non-responsive. And this is kind of unsettling to infants, and they'll start to cry and look away, and they just are distressed by a person just staring at them. It's a little bit bizarre and weird and unemotional. And they actually show better memory for the faces that engage in that still face paradigm than others, suggesting that the distressing nature of the event makes it so that they're actually better able to remember that particular event. At a very young age, infants show the ability to categorize information. So for example, 3-month-olds show that they categorize dogs in a different category than cats. And we know this by the habituation procedure. We can show them several dogs. They will get bored of seeing dog after dog after dog after dog. And then eventually we show them a cat and they perk up and show more attention toward it. And that tells us that all of these dogs are going into a different category and as like being in a classroom. And of course, you're not only, there's a whole lot going on around you. I mean, it could be there's someone who's on their computer sitting next to you, and so you can kind of see what websites they're visiting, and maybe on your other side there are two people who are talking, and then perhaps there are birds chirping outside of the classroom, and all of this is happening. And your ability to just pay attention to what the professor is saying and ignore everything else that is not relevant is selective attention. So again, young children often struggle with selective attention. These gains tend to appear between ages 6 and 10 and then continue to increase in adolescence. Now, in terms of working memory and executive function in children, we do see steady increases in executive function and working memory throughout childhood. And just as a refresher, these central executive functions include coordinating performance on 2 separate tasks or operations. You can think of this like divided attention. Trying to work on your homework and pay attention to a TV show at the same time, or what we shouldn't be doing, texting and driving, right? Well, that would be separating, doing 2 separate tasks at once. And we do see that improve throughout childhood and into adolescence. Switching between tasks, going from one thing to another gets better with age. Selective attending to specific information, and also retrieving information from long-term memory. So in childhood, children, as compared to young childhood, older children are much better able to pay attention and work with information. And you can really see this difference. This is part of why, you know, we don't do much schooling and education in 2- and 3-year-olds, but once they're about, 6 to 10, now we can start to actually work with textbooks and try to get them to remember information and test them on that information. Now, children, they kind of have a growing ability to use memory strategies. It doesn't start all that great. It's not really until late childhood, early adolescence that they show an ability to use these memory strategies. And these are strategies that make us more likely to remember things. So for example, rehearsal, systematically repeating something in order to retain it in your working memory, like that phone number, 867-5309, 867-5309, 867-5309. That keeps it, that rehearsal is a way for you to keep it in your working memory. Organization would be using categorization or chunking in order to remember items by theme. So you chunk all of the fruits together and it helps you to remember a list of fruits. Also, you see this with phone numbers as well. So if I say 867-5309, me saying 53 instead of 53 turns it into one bit of information. It's one number as opposed to 2 numbers, 53 versus 53. And that chunking helps us with working with information. Elaboration would be something like creating an imagined scene or a story in order to link the material to make it more meaningful. Now, across childhood, children learn more strategies and they get better at selecting them and modifying them to suit the task at hand, and therefore use them more efficiently. So we see much better studying skills and studying techniques, but absolutely, this is an area where people can still use some work into college and into adulthood of how do I get myself to remember this information better. In terms of knowledge, children acquire increasing amounts of information. They naturally organize this in meaningful ways. And as children learn more about a topic, their knowledge structures become more elaborate and organized, while the information becomes more familiar and meaningful and easier to recall. So we really see children turn into much better students as compared to in younger childhood. Long-term memory in children. Well, let's make a distinction between some different types of memories. First, episodic memory. This is memory for our particular events and what you learned during those events. So, for example, if I ask you what you did last 4th of July or on your last birthday party, right? That would be an episode in your life, and you remember the details of, oh, I went to my grandma's house and then we barbecued and this and that. Right, so that's an episode of your life. And then we also have memory for information. And this I really want to emphasize. I think it's important for college students to know the difference between these two types of memories. We've got recognition memory, our ability to simply recognize something that you've encountered before, and then also recall memory. This is the ability to generate the memory of a stimulus without actually seeing it again. This is really important for test taking because often when students are studying for a test, they will look through the slides and look through the book, and they'll kind of feel that they know everything. And really all that they're testing is that they recognize it. It's very different from when you actually go to take the test and say, I asked you, list the 4 stages of Piaget's cognitive development, and you're like, oh gosh, well I'd know them if I saw them, but I can't generate the list by myself. That shows that you don't actually know it as well. You always want to aim to be able to recall information without actually seeing it. I recommend trying to cover the page, cover the slides, and then try to teach it to yourself or to your cat in order to see if you actually remember it. Now, recognition memory, the ability to recognize something that you've encountered before, is pretty good in 4- and 5-year-old children. They can say if they've seen something before. But children are much less proficient at recall memory. And again, there are these differences that are even important in adulthood. Children show increasing ability to remember scripts and as well as adding details to their scripts. Scripts are a description of what occurs in a particular situation. So if I ask you, what do you do when you go out to eat? Well, you know, you're an adult and you've got great memory for scripts, so you'll probably say something like, well, you choose a restaurant, you drive there, you walk in, you can choose to sit at a booth or a table, you order food and drinks, and you eat and you pay for it. So you've got this kind of elaborate detail about what happens. Younger kids really just remember the main details. When you go out to eat, oh, you go to a restaurant and they give you food and you eat. Oh, and then you have to pay at the end. So it's much more thin in terms of their description. For autobiographical memory, autobiographical, you've probably heard before, this is personally meaningful events that took place at a particular time and in one's past. Now, we actually see that autobiographical memory is actually pretty terrible for memories before age 3. You don't remember being a young infant. You definitely don't remember being born. And I want you to think back. Try to think of your very earliest memory. For me, I'm not even sure if I can remember much before I was 5 years old. We call this infantile amnesia. And it's pretty typical across people. Usually about before age 3, we don't really have many memories. And it's thought that this has to do with language development. Is that because we don't have language to help us make sense of our memories and make sense of our stories and then store the description with words in our minds, because we don't have language, we don't encode it as a memory. And also, self-awareness may also be linked to the development of these personal memories and why we don't see it much before age 3. Self-awareness emerges at about 18 months. Some people might have memories that early, but really you need a pretty strong sense of identity. This idea of this is who I am and other people are affecting me and this is an event in my life, right? So we have this kind of personal self-awareness. That's also needed to develop your autobiographical memory. This autobiographical memory develops steadily from preschool through adolescence, and it's accompanied by increases in length and richness of that autobiography and complexity of recall. An important accomplishment in childhood is the development of theory of mind. This is children's awareness that their own and other people's mental processes exist, and they exist separately, that they can have ideas and thoughts and beliefs and emotions, and other people have their own ideas and thoughts and beliefs and emotions. We assess this by examining children's ability to understand that people can hold different beliefs about an object or an event that they themselves hold. A really common task is the false belief task. And this requires children to understand that someone doesn't share their knowledge. So they'll bring a child into a room and open up a Band-Aid box like you can see on the screen. And children will see that, in fact, there aren't Band-Aids on the inside, but there are pens on the inside. But if someone were to just walk in and see the Band-Aid box, what would they assume? They would assume that there were Band-Aids inside. However, the child has been let in on a secret that there aren't Band-Aids, that there are pens on the inside. So then we ask, hey, if your mom were to come in here, what do you think she would think is on the inside of the box? And if the child says pens, then they would not be showing a theory of mind. They would assume that because they know that there are pens inside, everyone must know that there are pens inside. If they say, she'll think there are Band-Aids, then they've developed that theory of mind, the awareness that other people have their own beliefs and perspectives and emotions separate from their own. Now, 3-year-olds typically show a pattern of false belief errors across procedures and across cultures. So this theory of mind seems to develop around age 3 or 4. However, there are some issues with testing, that it could just be that children, they understand the concept, but maybe they have difficulty communicating their understanding to the researcher, so it could be a task problem. We do know that theory of mind abilities are linked with executive function and also with language development and the ability to characterize what one is thinking with language and be able to communicate that. Theory of mind is a precursor to metacognition. Metacognition is the knowledge of how the mind works and also the ability to control the mind. So thinking about thought itself. We see a bit of this emerge in childhood. About between ages 2 and 5, children start to understand or think about thought, but it's really not fully developed at that time. It's not until about adolescence when we're really starting to think about our own thoughts and why we're thinking those thoughts and how we can change our thoughts and really kind of get above ourselves. And you'll hear teenagers say things like, I was thinking about why I was thinking this the other day. And that's really a hallmark of metacognition that you don't see until later on. Metamemory also begins to emerge in childhood. This is the understanding of one's memory and also the ability to use strategies in order to enhance their memory. And this is when you start to see very simple strategies like repeating something in order to keep it in your memory, or create a story about it in order to think about that a little bit more. But again, it doesn't really get fully sophisticated until adolescence or even into adulthood. In adolescence, we see greater control over their attention, and this allows them to better deploy their attention selectively. So they can better hold material in their working memory while taking in and processing new material. They're better able to selectively listen to their teacher and to shift their attention from their notes and to the slides, to the teacher's voice, and then back again. So shifting from here to here to here becomes much more smooth and coordinated in adolescence. Adolescents are also better able at response inhibition, not responding and not activating cognitive operations in response to a stimulus. So, for example, there may be these well-learned behaviors that are sometimes difficult to inhibit, but sometimes the behaviors are inappropriate. So, for example, if a child knows the answer to all of the questions in a class, then they raise their hand 1,000 times during class, and that becomes inappropriate because you're not allowing other students to have time themselves. In adolescence, they're able to realize that they need to give other people a chance, and so even though they know the answer, they inhibit their behavior and don't raise their hand, even though that is a well-learned behavior that they had developed earlier and feel comfortable doing. Working memory reaches adult-like levels at around age 19 and continues to improve into the 20s. Remember, working memory is that processing of information, bringing it into the desktop of your mind and thinking about it, problem solving with it, planning, coming up with strategies. In regards to thinking and metacognition in adolescence, adolescents become more planful about their cognitive system, how they take in, manipulate, and store information. They're better able to understand how they learn and remember, and to choose and deploy strategies that enhance the representation, storage, and retrieval of information. So this makes them much better students than than children are. And so you really see kind of the ramping up of academics into higher rigor during adolescence. Improvements in metacognition help adolescents appreciate logic, and they're able to apply it to particular situations like scientific reasoning. They still prefer single-factor solutions, and they don't develop complex reasoning to consider multiple influences at once until early adulthood, and that we had talked about briefly at the end of last chapter. There are some significant changes in the brain that happen during adolescence, and we've briefly talked about this before in a previous chapter, but just as a reminder, there are changes especially in the prefrontal cortex and the cerebellum, and this underlies improvements in information processing and executive function. There are decreases in gray matter, increases in white matter, and this help makes cognition more efficient. Essentially, this is due to myelination and the pruning of unneeded synapses. In terms of decision-making, adolescents begin having a much more purposeful decision-making process. They identify possible options for decisions. They identify the potential positive and negative consequences for each option. They estimate how likely each potential outcome is, rate how desirable that outcome is, and then combine all of this info into making a decision. But if you're anything like me, I still have a hard time even deciding what I'm going to have for dinner. I am so incredibly indecisive. So adolescents are capable of demonstrating rational decision-making that's in line with their goals and really comparable to that of adults. But, you know, adolescents still engage in those risk-taking behaviors. And the problem is that they might not always consider the practicalities associated with each option. They're more approach-oriented in response to positive feedback and less responsive to negative feedback. So they place more importance on the potential benefits of their decisions than on the potential costs or risks. Many of them are much more reward sensitive as opposed to punishment sensitive. And so they tend to make those decisions that will lead to more of those potential benefits, but then not really consider how it can get them in trouble over time. And neurological research really supports these findings. Adolescents show heightened activity in brain systems that support reward processing and also reduced activity in areas responsible for inhibitory control as compared to adults. The maturation of the prefrontal cortex, as we talked about before, which is responsible for decision making, this lags behind the development of the limbic system, remember, with emotional arousal. So you have them experiencing very strong emotional responses, but then not having the ability to really control and moderate their behavior, stop and think and make good decisions, which leads to that risk-taking behavior. In terms of adulthood, attention from middle into older adulthood, in regards to divided attention, it becomes more difficult to engage in two complex tasks at once and focus on relevant information. So again, texting and driving, it's not legal, but it's especially difficult as you get into middle and older adulthood. It is easier to engage in divided attention in younger adulthood as compared to middle and older adulthood. And sensory impairments may prevent information from getting into the cognitive system in the first place. So we see these sensory capacities like hearing, vision. This may affect what a person is able to pay attention to, what information is able to get in the brain and help them to work on. So that can then lead to difficulty with paying attention. Response inhibition also becomes more challenging with age, And adults find it increasingly difficult to resist interference from irrelevant information and stay focused on a task. So greater difficulty with ignoring everything else that's irrelevant and just focusing on the one thing that they need to focus on. That becomes a little bit more difficult to do. We see age-related declines in working memory from the 20s to the 60s, and changes in attention can influence these declines in working memory. There's an issue with proactive interference, that previously remembered information interferes with memory for new information. So because you've learned something from before, you experienced an event before, when something new happens, you don't have the best ability to pay attention to it, work on it, remember it, and recall it. So that previous information kind of dominates over the newer information. Now, there are some challenges to measuring processing speed, attention, and memory in adults, because much of the time when we're doing this, it's in the laboratory, and so it can kind of seem a little bit artificial in the tasks that we're giving them. Now, middle-aged and older adults are less motivated by memory tasks in the laboratory as compared to younger people, and this may be because younger people have more recent school experience. So they, just thinking about what school experience is like, is you're kind of given information, you're expected to remember it and digest it and then be tested on it nearly immediately. And this isn't really natural for people who haven't been in school. So when we instead give a task where adults are allowed to self-pace learning information, paying attention to it, and recalling it, they tend to do a lot better. Also, declines in memory are less apparent when we look at everyday life tasks as compared to laboratory tasks. So the more realistic the task is, we see lesser declines in memory for middle and older adults. Older adults do tend to score better on working memory tasks if it evokes positive feelings as compared to neutral or negative feelings. So positive mood enhances working memory. And why is this? Well, it's possibly due to their greater focus on managing their emotions. Older adults have become better able at cognitive control mechanisms in order to enhance their own positive emotions. So they're more positive emotion oriented. They focus on the positive to maintain mood, and thus they have greater memory for positive. If you pay attention to it, then your memory is better for it over time. Most adults show difficulties with recall of long-term memory. In terms of semantic memory, remember this is memory for factual material, like who is the president of the first president of the United States, that would be a fact. That shows little age-related decline, whereas episodic memory, this memory for experiences, deteriorates with age. And the memories that we do recall tend to be from ages 10 to 30, and older adults show poor recall for more recent memories. Why is this? There are a couple theories, a couple reasons why it may be that most of your memories come from between age 10 and 30. It might be a difference in how we're processing information when we're younger. It's different in how we're paying attention to information. Information is particularly salient and really important to the self because we're developing our identities at that time. It could also be, too, that events are quite a bit more novel. Think about how new and interesting everything was when you were 17. And for those of you, you may still be 17, but what you'll see is that, things kind of lose their newness as you age because you're not encountering it for the first time. You've seen things before, you've done things before. So the novelty may mean that you're not finding nearly as much interest in it, not paying as much attention to it, and then therefore it could affect your recall of it. And, in adulthood, maybe things just kind of start to blend together. I mean, how many nights have you, had dinner of spaghetti meatballs or whatever it is? It becomes very mundane and very typical. How many days do you go into work? Well, they all start to kind of blend together and lose their specialness over time. And also, maybe new memories are interfering with the memories from before. And so it could be that the memory for yesterday is not as good as the memory from 1 or 2 years ago because yesterday is more salient, is more recent. Now, In terms of contextual factors, generational differences in cognitive performance, so what we're talking about here is looking at different generations. And you can kind of broadly think of this like a millennial generation and a boomer generation, but we aren't really defining it that specifically. And instead you can think of it like people who are around 50-year-old or around 70-year-old. So cohorts of people. Younger cohorts do show better performance on a range of cognitive measures. That's what the charts show on the right-hand side. And less steep age-related declines. And this might possibly be due to differences in educational systems, quality of education, the years of education, or maybe disease prevalence or even nutrition could lead to differences in cognitive declines as we age. There is a fairly significant change in information processing capacity due to a reduction in the speed of processing, so how quickly we process information. The more complex the task, the greater the age-related decline in reaction time. So think about reaction time like pressing a button when you see a light, right? That's an example of reaction time. You're sitting there waiting, the light flashes, and then you click on the button. And that's a very simple task, but the tasks can get much more complex in terms of our reaction time to information. And this is influenced by their capacity for attention. Highly distractible adults perform worse on processing speed tasks. If you're distracted, you're not able to take in the information and process it. Declines in processing speed predict age-related declines in memory, reasoning, problem solving, and this may be caused by a loss of white matter, the myelinated connections. Remember, that's like the slip and slide, the water on the slip and slide that helps us with the speed of transmission, as well as the formation of new and less efficient neural connections. But in adulthood, we do see the development of expertise and problem-solving techniques, and for some people, wisdom. Expertise is when a person develops an elaborate and integrated knowledge base that has, it kind of gives them this extraordinary proficiency in a particular task. So someone could have expertise in playing chess, right? Or expertise in math, or expertise in other areas. So this supports gains in practical problem solving when it's related to that particular task. It peaks in middle adulthood, where people become experts in particular areas. A person can operate more intuitively, automatically, strategically, and flexibly. So even though they have slower processing time, they develop these kind of automatic and flexible and strategic responses. So for example, this is kind of an older study looking at typists, people who type. And the younger typists process and see the information and move their fingers quickly. But older typists look ahead a little bit more to make up for their slower processing speed, and therefore overall don't show a decrease in their processing time. And you can think about other areas in which people may develop expertise. And kind of what's coming to mind for me, I think I've been watching too much cooking Netflix shows, are those food street vendors who make the same type of food, the same tortilla or the same crepe over and over and over again. And it seems so automatic, like they don't even have to think about it. So even though processing speed decreases, they have these very automatic and strategic behaviors that make up for it and make them very fast and experts for that particular skill. Now, in those who are aging optimally, we see selective optimization with compensation. So this is adapting to changes over time. A person may be losing their eyesight, and maybe glasses aren't really helping out that much anymore. So even though they used to be quite a prolific reader, they can't do that as well anymore. So maybe they switch to books on tape, or maybe they pick up a different hobby like pottery making, and that they can do by feeling instead of just by looking. So in this case, they're compensating for their losses in order to preserve performance and maintain kind of this optimal aging experience. Problem solving declines with age, largely due to memory changes that make it more difficult for older adults to retain and manipulate information needed to solve the problem. Yet, when decisions tap into their relevant experience or knowledge, they're just as effective as making decisions as younger adults. Thus, they tend to remain efficient decision makers. Wisdom, I think, is a really interesting area of research, and so I wanted to elaborate on this just a little bit more. Your book defines wisdom as expertise in the conduct and meanings of life, characterized by emotional maturity and the ability to show insight and apply it to problems. So, just extending this a little bit, there's a researcher with the last name of Jest, J-E-S-T, who found kind of overlaps in modern science and ancient philosophy that point to 6 key qualities of wisdom. And here are those qualities of wisdom. A general knowledge of life and good judgment in social situations, control over your emotions, pro-social behaviors like empathy, compassion, altruism, and a sense of fairness, insight into oneself and one's actions, so the ability to see what mistakes you've made, value relativism, or accepting that we don't know what the truth is sometimes, and also decisiveness. Now, there's a variability in the extent to which older adults actually display wisdom. Life experience, particularly facing and managing adversity, contributes to the development of wisdom, but it still might be a relatively rare quality. It's found in all ages, but typically improves with age. So older people are more likely to be more wise. Now, just wrapping up here regarding the influences on cognitive change in adulthood. Aspects of cognition that rely on fluid intelligence decline in older age, but crystallized intelligence remains the same or improves. Education is super important. It's a very strong predictor of cognitive performance and problem solving throughout the lifespan. Physical and mental health, being in good health, not just in terms of nutrition and exercise, but also mental health, like avoiding significant problems like depression and anxiety, predicts cognitive performance. And there are some interventions for cognitive skills that can preserve and even reverse some age-related cognitive declines. But I encourage you, if you're interested in some of those kind of brain exercise or brain development programs, before you spend a lot of money, really look into the research. Don't just their research, but try to find a third-party research study to validate that what they're doing is effective, because sometimes they can just be trying to get your money. However, keeping your mind active, doing puzzles, learning, reading, attending classes throughout the lifespan is absolutely associated with improved cognitive performance. All right, thank you so much.